Hey guys, today's video, a Christian will try to argue that Christians don't actually make God of the Gaps arguments, and that's actually atheists who are misinterpreting them. Let's see if he has a case.
This is Darwin to Jesus. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to tackle a common accusation that atheists often make against Christians, the so-called God of the Gaps fallacy. In case you haven't heard of this, I'll explain what it is. Then I'll explain why atheists are often misusing this phrase. Before I begin, I want to say that if I see any good responses to this video by an atheist, I will respond to the best one. Stick to the arguments, be clear, and make good points, and you will be the winner. Now let's get into it. The expression God of the Gaps is normally said by atheists when a theist points to something that science has not yet explained, and the atheist is accusing the theist of making the argument, science can't explain this, therefore God. Now obviously, if the atheists were correct in their interpretation of what's happening, then they'd be right, and this would be a fallacy.
Well, anytime that I've called an argument God of the Gaps, that's exactly what was happening. But I'll give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that you have seen atheists call something God of the Gaps when it wasn't, especially if you can point out some examples. As long as you can admit that oftentimes there are Christians who do what you just described as a fallacy, on YouTube especially.
You get on your knees and you pray to an invisible man in the sky.
Invisible man in the sky.
You don't think that's a scam?
No, I don't.
You look at a
and I'll tell you
statue
why.
of a man that was built by a man?
I'll tell you why it's not a scam, in my opinion. All right? Tide goes in, tide goes out. Never a miscommunication. You can't explain that. You can explain why the tide goes in.
Tide goes in, tide goes out.
See, the water, the tide comes in and it goes out, Mr. Silverman.
Maybe
it always
it's
comes
Thor
in
on top of Mount Olympus who's making the tides go in and out.
No, but you can't explain.
But they're not right about what's happening. So here's what's actually happening. Imagine two detectives arrive at a scene where a body has been found. They are faced with two potential theories to explain what happened. The first detective believes that the best explanation for the evidence is that a murder took place. Someone else was involved in the death. The second detective, however, thinks that the person died of natural causes, meaning no other person was involved. As they examine the evidence, both detectives try to fit the facts with their respective theories. The detective who believes in the murder theory might point to bloody footprints leading away from the scene and say to the other detective, "If your theory is correct and no one else was involved in this death, how do you explain these bloody footprints?" The detective isn't necessarily claiming that the footprints prove there was a murder, but he is challenging the natural cause theory to account for this evidence. This scenario is analogous to discussions between theists and atheists. In these debates, we are dealing with two overarching theories. Either God exists, theism, implying that a mind is responsible for the existence of everything, or God does not exist, atheism, suggesting that everything can be explained by natural causes without a mind, naturalism.
These situations are not analogous. To begin with, we know for a fact that people can die of natural causes because we've seen it happen many times before. We also know for a fact that people can be killed. We know that killers exist because as a society, we have dealt with them many times before. We do not know for a fact how universes come to be. We only have one universe to study, and we don't know why it is the way that it is, as opposed to the many deaths available to study, and the fact that we can find out exactly how they died. And unlike killers, we don't know for a fact that God exists. So the entire premise of the analogy is off to a pretty shaky start. The next thing you go to is the bloody footprints. Now, in this situation, bloody footprints are a really good clue that could lead the detectives directly to the person who left the footprints, so they could get more info. And we know for a fact that footprints like these come from people. Now, if you're going to imply that Christians have really good clues, like the bloody footprints in the death investigation, to point to as evidence for God and ask atheists to explain, then you're going to have to give a good example of evidence that would match that in quality. From my perspective, watching this right now, I'm thinking, yeah, those bloody footprints are a really good clue that could be and should be followed up on. But I can't think of any evidence I've seen for God that would be as convincing as those footprints in this investigation. If you want me, or anyone, quite frankly, to take this analogy seriously at all, then you'll have to give some specific examples on what would be a parallel for what these footprints represent in the God argument. Otherwise, from what I can see, it just makes the analogy look like an even worse fit. I'm not saying there needs to be actual footprints from God to make this make sense, but I'm asking what evidence or pieces of evidence you thought of when you came up with this part of the analogy. All in all, given that deaths and murders happen all the time and only one universe, as far as we know for a fact, exists, and we don't know how it happened, as opposed to us being able to figure out for a fact how people die, and we know for a fact people kill other people exist and aren't supernatural, the whole analogy from top to bottom is a terrible fit. So let's see what else you got.
When theists observe certain facts that seem difficult to explain on naturalism, they ask atheists, how do you explain this on your theory? For example, theists might point to the origin of life and ask, how do you explain life arising from non-life? On naturalism, it's challenging to understand how life could emerge from non-life, as this seems counterintuitive.
I hope this isn't supposed to be analogous to the footprints in your analogy, because saying it doesn't make sense to me that life can come from non-life is not evidence for a God. Like bloody footprints are evidence for someone who was involved in the death. Just because something is challenging to explain or seems counterintuitive doesn't mean that it cannot be explained, and it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. While abiogenesis hasn't been proven and may seem counterintuitive to some people, there is evidence that it can happen. For example, the Miller-Urey experiment proved that it is possible for amino acids to form from inorganic material spontaneously. While this experiment isn't perfect and doesn't explain everything required for abiogenesis, and more work is needed, of course, it does show that it's possible. There are also theories other than abiogenesis on Earth leading to life on Earth. For example, panspermia is the theory that a meteor carried cellular organisms to Earth to start life here. This theory has evidence, such as the fact that meteors carrying amino acids and other organic molecules have in fact landed on Earth, and there have been studies that show microorganisms could survive in space inside a meteor. There are even microorganisms that can survive in open space for a long period of time. The point is that there is evidence from multiple theories about how life could have started on Earth naturally and without the existence of a God. While the two theories about life starting on Earth I mentioned haven't been proven to be a fact, they are proven to be possible, and quite frankly, have better evidence than the existence of a God, at least in my opinion. I don't claim that either of those is in fact how life started on Earth, but the point is that there are possibilities other than God. And given the fact that every gap in our knowledge so far that has been filled was filled by a natural explanation as opposed to a supernatural one, it's very reasonable to think that a natural explanation is likely to explain how life began on Earth.
However, on theism, it's much easier to explain because an intelligent designer, God, could have created life. This question is not a God of the gaps argument, where God is invoked simply because something is unexplained. Instead, it's a comparison of which theory, naturalism or theism, better accounts for the available evidence.
To begin, the fact that theism makes the origin of life easier to explain has nothing to do with its validity in explaining how life actually began. Secondly, you are correct. The way you have set this up isn't a God of the gaps argument. If the argument is that God is a better explanation for the origin of life because it's a simpler, more intuitive explanation, that isn't a God of the gaps argument. It is an appeal to simplicity argument. The problem with that argument, though, is that it requires one key piece we do not have, and that piece is to prove God actually exists. Now, if you could do that, then it would actually be a pretty good argument. You could say, well, we know God exists, so the simplest explanation for the origin of life is God. But until you can prove he exists, that appeal to simplicity doesn't actually work. But back to the core point of the video being that atheists are misinterpreting Christian arguments as God of the gaps. Sure, there are probably atheists out there calling arguments God of the gaps when that is inaccurate. But the reason you hear God of the gaps accusations being thrown around so often is because it does actually happen fairly often. There are Christians, especially those who are just regular people on the internet talking about it, who use God of the gaps arguments. And just because you can make arguments that aren't God of the Gaps doesn't mean there aren't Christians out there doing it in YouTube videos, and it doesn't mean every time an atheist calls something God of the Gaps, they're wrong.
Just like the detectives comparing their theories, the best explanation is the one that can account for the most facts in the simplest and most coherent way. Theists argue that their worldview provides a more straightforward and comprehensive explanation for certain phenomena, such as the origin of life, than atheism does. When a theist asks, "What is your explanation for this phenomena?" whether it be consciousness, the beginning of life, or the beginning of the universe, and the atheist has no answer because science has not solved the problem, the atheist might respond by saying, "Well, you're just assuming that God must be responsible." In doing so, the atheist is really admitting that they don't have any explanation within their worldview for these phenomena.
Okay, so to start, how does theism or Christianity account for the most facts in the simplest, most coherent way? You just asserted that theists argue it does, and then you didn't give any sort of argument, you just moved on. I certainly don't agree that it does, and why does it have to be the simplest explanation? Sure, oftentimes the simplest explanation is the right answer, but not always. And like I said, Christianity is only the simplest explanation if it can be proven that God exists. If God hasn't even been proven to exist, then how can it be the simplest explanation for anything? Now, as an atheist, I will admit that everyone, including myself, does not know for sure the origin of life, exactly how consciousness works, or how the universe began, if it even began at all. But at the same time, there are possible theories backed up by evidence for all of those things that entirely exclude God. Now, I don't say the Big Bang Theory or abiogenesis did in fact start the universe and life on Earth, respectively. But I think they have better evidence than the existence of God. So, no, there are possible explanations within a worldview that excludes God for those phenomena, although anyone saying that there is a definitive explanation is mistaken. On top of this, even if there was no other possible explanation for those things yet, the evidence that a God exists, and especially the evidence that the Christian God exists, is all circumstantial. There isn't a single shred of direct evidence for God's existence. Given this fact, is it really reasonable to say that God is the best explanation for the mentioned phenomena if all the evidence he even actually exists is circumstantial? Now, sure, the evidence for the Big Bang is circumstantial too, but the difference is that I don't say the Big Bang did in fact happen. I say that I don't know how the universe started, and Christians do actually say that God is in fact real and is responsible for the mentioned phenomena. Their certainty does not make them right, and if they want to actually convince anyone who has yet to be convinced, they have to actually prove God exists first. Just like if someone wants to convince people the Big Bang Theory is in fact the origin of the universe as we know it, they have to prove that's what actually happened. Since neither of those things have been proven, I don't consider either a fact, although I do think one is more likely than the other. A good start would be direct evidence, like the footprints in your analogy. The problem is, though, that no direct evidence like that exists.
This situation would be like a detective who believes a murder took place, pointing to bloody footprints leaving the scene and asking his partner, "How do you explain these bloody footprints if the cause of death was natural? How do you explain these if there was no other person involved?" If the other detective then dismisses this by saying, "This is just murder of the gaps," without actually addressing the question, it's clear how disingenuous and lacking in substance that response would be. The question by the first detective is legitimate and deserves an answer, but instead the response shifts to a straw man argument about what the first detective is saying. Similarly, when atheists resort to the God of the Gaps accusation, they're tacitly admitting that their worldview is unable to account for certain phenomena and facts that we observe. Instead of acknowledging this, they misrepresent the theist position by asserting that we're saying, "You don't know, therefore God." But that's not what actually is being said. It's not, "You don't know, therefore God must exist." Rather, it's, "You can't explain this on your theory, so my theory should be the one that we consider, because your theory fails to account for this, and my theory has no problem accounting for this." So this is actually just an inference to the best explanation type argument.
The problem here is that Your theory actually does have a problem accounting for it, because your theory that God created the universe, life, consciousness, or anything once again requires you first to prove that God exists. If you cannot prove that, you cannot say your theory has no problem accounting for any of those things. That would be like saying Bob committed a murder before you've even proven Bob exists. If someone said that without even proving Bob exists, would you say their theory has no problem accounting for the facts of the murder? In the detective example, once again, we know that people exist and we know that they can leave footprints. So, yeah, that does work. But the problem is that we don't have any footprints or any physical evidence of God to this point. Any evidence that is not circumstantial to point to. So, like I said at the beginning, the analogy is not like the situation we are talking about. Now, if you can first point to some direct evidence that God was involved, you deserve some explanation rather than a hand wave. But in this video, you haven't done that, and you haven't provided a link to a video where you or someone else does provide some direct evidence. So do that first, and then we can talk about your explanation. Until then, there is no evidence like footprints that needs explaining.
Another thing that I want to address is the misconception that if something is explained scientifically, then that necessarily entails naturalism, and that we should think if something has a scientific explanation, we don't need to ask any further questions. This is simply not the case. To illustrate, imagine two very smart ants studying a car engine. They could crawl around the engine, examine how it works, and even figure out the purposes of each part scientifically. They might learn that if certain components move, the pistons fire, and they could eventually understand the entire operation of the engine. But no matter how much they study it scientifically, they'd never be able to answer why the engine exists, or why the engine is put together in the way that it is. The question of why there is a working engine is entirely different from the question of how does this engine work. In this scenario, the engine was obviously designed, but a scientific ant focused solely on how things work might never come to that conclusion. This analogy shows that science, while incredibly powerful for understanding mechanisms and processes, is not equipped to answer deeper questions about purpose, meaning, or origins. Notice I'm not saying that purpose, meaning, or design exist, but what I am saying is that if they exist, science couldn't tell us. Just like the ants wouldn't discover the engine's creator through scientific inquiry alone, we can't fully understand the why of the universe or life itself by only asking how questions.
If the ants wanted to know why the engine exists in the first place, they could travel far and wide until they stumble upon an engine factory. They could find out that the reason the engine exists is that people made it, and then they could see people putting the engine in a car. And then they could see that the engine is what creates power that allows the car to move. They could discover direct evidence for why the engine exists by doing field research and observation, which is scientific inquiry. However, whether they ask how or why the engine exists, they could still discover that humans made it. Once they discover that the engine definitely exists because humans made it, they could ask why they made it. But now we're getting ahead of ourselves. The point is that asking how or why the universe exists is the same question until we find out whether the how was a natural process or if it was the intentional process of a thinking being. If we do find out that the universe was created by a God, then we could ask, well, why did that God make it? But until then, the why and how are the same question. How does the universe exist? Why does the universe exist? Well, God did it, or the Big Bang happened, or whatever it is. How gets at the question just as well as why, and science finds out how and why things exist all the time. Why does rain exist? Answered by science. Why does the ocean have currents? Answered by science. Science can answer why questions, and it does all the time. Just because it hasn't answered every single why question doesn't mean it can't answer the why questions you've asked here in the future. As far as we know, purpose, meaning, and design only make sense in the context of our own consciousness. We could find out if they exist as fixed aspects of the universe if we could discover that God does, in fact, exist, just like the ants can discover humans do, in fact, exist, and they're the ones making the engine through scientific inquiry. And then they can find out why we made the engine. But until we find out that God does, in fact, exist, there is no reason to think that the universe intrinsically contains purpose, meaning, and design. You first have to find out whether the universe was designed at all before you start asking questions about the design, not the other way around. Both can be done with science, but we still need to respect our order of operations. Just like there is no reason for the ants to think that the engine has a purpose, meaning, or design until they discover that humans exist and made the engine by doing scientific inquiry. No one is stopping you from inquiring about purpose, meaning, or design in the universe, just like no one is stopping the ants from inquiring about how the engine exists in the first place. Science could answer the question, but the problem is that if God is real, he has refused to leave any direct evidence of his existence. If you have a problem with that, that is between you and your God. Maybe if you pray enough, he'll throw you a bone and allow you to find some direct evidence. Until then, stop pretending he's the simplest explanation for the mentioned phenomenon.
What's really ironic about all this is that atheists are often guilty of committing naturalism of the gaps. When atheists accuse theists of committing God of the gaps, they argue that theists are inappropriately filling in gaps in scientific knowledge with a divine explanation. However, this critique overlooks the fact that atheists themselves often engage in naturalism of the gaps. They assume that any gap in our current understanding will eventually be filled by a naturalistic explanation, even though they have no evidence for this at present. This is essentially the same kind of leap that they are criticizing the theists for making.
This is not the same kind of leap. To begin with, every previous gap in human knowledge that is as of today filled is because of science. None of those previous gaps that are now filled ended up having any kind of supernatural explanation. So it is much more reasonable to assume that science, the thing that has filled every previous gap, will fill the next one, instead of assuming that something supernatural, something that has thus far filled 0 previous gaps in our knowledge, will fill the next one. While it is much more reasonable to assume the next gap will be filled with science, at the end of the day, it is best not to assume anything about things we do not know. So you could criticize atheists for making this assumption, but you can't say it's just as bad as God of the gaps assumption when God, or anything supernatural, has so far not been proven to fill any of the gaps. And all of the previous gaps that are now filled are filled because of science. Besides, simply pointing out that some atheists can be criticized for something similar is just whataboutism, trying to distract from the God of the gaps argument by pointing out something similar on the other side. But the problem is that I agree. We shouldn't assume either way. Even though I think that what you describe as naturalism of the gaps is much more reasonable than God of the gaps, I don't think either are good. Finally, I don't think this was a very good video. The analogies were really bad and didn't fit the situation very well. As I pointed out, the whole premise of the video was basically that theists don't actually do God of the gaps. Theists are actually like this detective in this terrible analogy that doesn't fit the situation, when in reality, you can see theists all over YouTube doing God of the gaps. If you don't believe me, go check out some of Logic's videos about theists. They make them all the time over there in those videos. Now, I don't know that you personally make this kind of argument. Maybe you don't. Maybe you have been criticized for it when you didn't actually do it. But you can't deny that many do. And if you wanted to make the point better, instead of the awful analogy in which you didn't clarify what evidence or pieces of evidence the footprints are supposed to represent, you should have given a real-life example or a compilation of theists making non-God of the gaps arguments and atheists calling it God of the gaps. Then you would have a much better argument. But that isn't what you did. What you did was pretend that theists don't actually make those arguments. The atheists saying they do are just disingenuous, and just assuming that there is a natural explanation like there is in every single thing that we can't explain thus far is just as bad as saying God did it when we don't even know that he exists. So if that's the case, then I would say that you're actually the one being disingenuous with your terrible analogies, apples to oranges comparisons of God and naturalism of the gaps. So hopefully I win your prize and you decide to respond to my video.
and you get on your knees and you pray to an
Correct.
invisible man in the sky.
Invisible
and you
man
don't
in the
think
sky.
That's a scam?
No, I don't.
You look
you know,
at a
and I'll tell you
statue of
why.
a man that was built by a man?
I'll tell you why it's not a scam, in my opinion. All right? Tide goes in, tide goes out. Never a miscommunication. You can't explain that. You can explain why the tide goes in.
Tide goes in, tide goes out.
See, the water, the tide comes in and it goes out, Mr. Silverman.
Maybe
it
it's
always comes
Thor
in
on top of
and
Mount
goes
Olympus
out.
who's making the tides go in and out.
No, but you can't explain.
Alright, I think that about does it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to support the channel. I really appreciate that. And I hope you found this video helpful. Have a wonderful day, and God bless.
Alright, guys. That was an interesting perspective about how our ears deceive us and God of the Gaps arguments don't actually happen. Let me know what you think in the comments, and Darwin to Jesus, I expect a response.